Jack Morgan stared at the tiny blip on his radar screen, calculating the intercept trajectory in his head as his squadron of F-22 Raptors streaked through the night sky. The enemy aircraft had no idea they were there, invisible, deadly, and guided by intelligence so precise it bordered on prophetic. That intelligence came from one person, a quiet supply clerk everyone overlooked, until he became the most lethal ghost in the United States Air Force. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Bogey at 2 o'clock, potential hostile, Jack's wingman called over the secure channel. Roger that. Maintain formation and standby, Jack responded, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He knew exactly what the aircraft was, a modified Su-35, carrying experimental weapons that could potentially neutralize their stealth capabilities. What he didn't tell his squadron was how he knew. The intelligence hadn't come through official Pentagon channels or high-level intelligence briefs. It had come from a supply clerk stationed at their home base in Nevada. A man who had never seen combat, never flown a mission, and who spent his days inventorying spare parts and processing requisition forms. A man named David Coleman. 6 months earlier, David had been just another face in the sprawling logistics department at Nellis Air Force Base. His desk was tucked away in a windowless room, surrounded by inventory lists and procurement schedules. At 35, he was older than most of his peers, having joined the Air Force late after spending years working for a shipping company in his hometown of Billings, Montana. Coleman, we need the requisition forms for the new targeting systems by end of day, Captain Harris barked as he passed David's desk that fateful morning. Already completed them, sir, David replied quietly, sliding a folder across his desk. And I noticed a discrepancy in the serial numbers that might cause issues with compatibility. I've noted the correction on page 3. Harris paused, surprised. He flipped to page 3 and scanned it quickly. How did you catch this? Engineering didn't even flag it. David shrugged slightly. I process a lot of paperwork, sir. Patterns stand out after a while. What David didn't say was that he'd been meticulously documenting every piece of equipment that passed through the base for the past 3 years. Not just serial numbers and maintenance schedules, but usage patterns, deployment frequencies, and cross-references with mission reports that technically he shouldn't have had access to. His mind worked differently than most. He saw connections where others saw only data points. But in the rigid hierarchy of military structure, no one had ever thought to ask the quiet supply clerk what he saw in the endless stream of paperwork that flowed across his desk. That changed when Colonel Marcus Wright stepped into the logistics office one Tuesday afternoon. Frustration etched across his face. Harris, we've got a problem with the intel on those cross-border operations. Something doesn't add up with the satellite data versus what our pilots are encountering. David glanced up from his terminal, then quickly looked back down. He'd noticed the same discrepancy weeks ago while processing fuel consumption reports. The missions were burning more fuel than they should have been, which meant the flight paths weren't matching the official reports. Sir, David said, his voice barely audible. Permission to speak? Colonel Wright turned, seemingly noticing David for the first time. Go ahead, Airman. Coleman, sir. David Coleman. I think I might know what's causing the discrepancy. The room fell silent as David pulled up a series of spreadsheets on his terminal. These are the fuel consumption reports from the last 6 operations. If you compare them with the recorded flight paths, there's a consistent 12% variance. But if you overlay them with these weather pattern reports from the same dates, he pulled up another screen showing wind direction and velocity data. The variance disappears if you account for this high-altitude jet stream that wasn't in the pre-mission calculations. Colonel Wright stared at the screen, then at David. You figured this out from fuel reports? Yes, sir. It's just pattern recognition. That evening, David found himself in a secure briefing room for the first time in his career, surrounded by intelligence officers and squadron commanders. He explained his methodology again, this time to a more skeptical audience. "With all due respect, Colonel," Major Simmons said, "we're talking about letting a supply clerk influence operational planning based on—" "What? Fuel receipts and a hunch?" David didn't flinch. "Not a hunch, sir. Data correlation. The same principles apply whether you're tracking shipping manifests or flight patterns. It's about finding the inconsistencies that point to hidden variables." Colonel Wright studied David for a long moment. "Coleman, how would you apply this approach to our current operational challenges? Specifically, these reports of unidentified aircraft skirting our patrol zones?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been waiting for without realizing it. For 3 years, he'd been seeing patterns in the data that no one else had bothered to look for. Now someone was finally asking him what he saw. "Sir, I believe those aren't random incursions. There's a pattern to them, but it's not visible unless you correlate 3 separate data sets." He pulled out his personal tablet and opened a file he'd been working on during his off hours. "These are maintenance requests for our early warning radar systems, weather anomaly reports from our meteorological division, and flight schedule changes for our patrol squadrons." He displayed a map with colored dots representing each data point. When viewed separately, each looks random. But when overlaid, the dots formed clear corridors, pathways where the unknown aircraft had slipped through their detection grid during precisely timed gaps in coverage. "They're exploiting our blind spots," Colonel Wright murmured. "And you figured this out from supply chain data?" "Logistics is about seeing the whole system, sir. Where things come from, where they go, and what disrupts the flow. In this case, what disrupts our detection capabilities." 2 days later, David Coleman was transferred from the logistics department to a newly created position, Strategic Pattern Analysis Specialist. His windowless office was replaced by a small room adjacent to the intelligence center, filled with monitors displaying data feeds that most supply clerks would never be cleared to see. His first official analysis led to the interception of an unmarked surveillance aircraft that had been gathering intelligence on their deployment patterns for months. His second prevented a potential mid-air collision between a commercial airliner and a military transport due to a communications protocol error no one else had identified. By his 3rd month in the new position, pilots had started to take notice of the unusually precise intelligence briefings before their missions. Information that seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they happened, identifying threats that conventional analysis had missed. "Who's this Coleman guy?" Jack Morgan asked his squadron leader after a particularly successful interception. "His intel is spooky accurate. Some supply clerk they pulled out of logistics," came the reply. "Apparently, he sees patterns no one else does. The brass is calling him the calculator now." Jack laughed. "A supply clerk? Seriously? What's he going to do, count the enemy to death?" He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The turning point came 6 months into David's new role. A routine patrol mission over international waters turned hostile when 3 enemy fighters appeared from nowhere, their signatures masked by sophisticated electronic countermeasures. Captain Reynolds' squadron was outnumbered and potentially outgunned. Standard protocol would have been to retreat and reassess. But they had something the enemy didn't expect: real-time guidance from a supply clerk staring at data points on a screen thousands of miles away. Hostiles executing Cobra maneuver. David's calm voice came through their secure channel. "Suggest inverted split at heading 030, then vertical climb at mark 321 mark." Reynolds followed the instructions without question. His squadron executed the precise sequence of maneuvers David called out, seemingly impossible predictions that placed them in perfect position to neutralize the threat without firing a shot. The enemy fighters, suddenly finding themselves outmaneuvered and exposed, retreated rather than risking engagement. When Reynolds' squadron returned to base, he went straight to the intelligence center. "I need to meet this Coleman guy," he demanded. "He just saved my entire squadron." David looked up from his screens as Reynolds entered his office. The captain had expected someone impressive, perhaps a former pilot with combat experience, who'd transferred to intelligence work. Instead, he found a slightly built man with glasses and the quiet demeanor of someone more comfortable with spreadsheets than people. "You're Coleman? The calculator?" David nodded, uncomfortable with the nickname that had spread throughout the base. "How did you know what they were going to do before they did it? Those maneuvers you called out, they were perfect counters to moves the enemy hadn't even executed yet." David gestured to his screens. "It's not magic, Captain. It's just data. I've been analyzing combat footage and telemetry from every encounter with these particular pilots for months. They follow patterns, unconscious habits in how they respond to certain situations. Once you identify the patterns, you can predict the responses." Reynolds stared at him in disbelief. "You're telling me you can read enemy pilots' minds through data?" "Not their minds, sir. Just their training. Every pilot is shaped by their training program. It creates signatures in how they fly, like handwriting." Word of what had happened spread quickly. Pilots began requesting calculator guidance for their missions. Senior officers who had initially been skeptical now sought David's input on operational planning. And somewhere along the line, someone started keeping count. "That's confirmed kill number 7 for Coleman's predictions," a technician noted after a successful strike mission. The enemy fighter had been neutralized exactly where and when David had predicted it would be vulnerable. By kill number 15, no one was questioning David's methods anymore. His pattern recognition had expanded beyond flight data to include communication frequencies, maintenance schedules, and even fuel supply lines. He could identify vulnerabilities in enemy operations that conventional intelligence missed entirely. "He's like a human algorithm," Colonel Wright explained to a visiting general. "He processes information differently than the rest of us. Where we see random data points, he sees connections." The general looked skeptical. "And this supply clerk has how many confirmed kills now?" 23, sir." Without ever leaving his desk or firing a weapon. David heard these conversations, but remained focused on his screens. The numbers didn't matter to him, only the patterns. And the patterns were telling him something that no one else had noticed yet. Something that would lead to his greatest prediction and his most difficult ethical challenge. As his kill count approached 30, David noticed a disturbing correlation in the data. The enemy's tactics weren't just becoming more aggressive. They were specifically adapting to counter the very predictions he was making. It was as if they somehow knew about his role and were deliberately changing their patterns to confuse his analysis. "There's a leak," he told Colonel Wright one evening, after everyone else had left the intelligence center. "Someone is feeding information about our methodologies to the other side." "That's a serious accusation, Coleman. Do you have proof?" David shook his head. "Not proof in the conventional sense, but the statistical probability of these tactical adaptations happening randomly is virtually zero. They know about me, sir. They're changing their behavior specifically to counter my predictions." The colonel frowned. "I can't launch a counterintelligence operation based on statistical probabilities, no matter how confident you are." "I understand, sir, but I'd like permission to run an experiment." The experiment was simple but brilliant. David created 3 separate intelligence briefs for an upcoming mission, each with slightly different predictions and recommendations. Each brief was distributed to a different group within the command structure. Only Colonel Wright knew that 2 of them contained deliberately misleading information. The mission proceeded as planned, with Jack Morgan's squadron encountering exactly the scenario that David had predicted, but only in the authentic brief that had gone to Colonel Wright himself. The enemy had prepared countermeasures specifically designed to thwart the tactics outlined in one of the false briefs. "The leak is in Group B," David told the colonel afterward. "Specifically, it has to be one of these 3 individuals who had access to that version of the brief." He handed over a short list of names. Counterintelligence officers took over from there. Within 2 weeks, they had identified and apprehended a senior communications officer who had been compromised by enemy intelligence. The security breach was contained, but the incident raised David's profile even higher within military circles. By the time his kill count reached 40, David Coleman had become something of a legend. The quiet supply clerk whose predictive analysis had saved more American lives than any single combat pilot, whose desk-bound calculations had neutralized more enemy assets than entire squadrons, and who had never fired a shot or even raised his voice in the process. But with recognition came danger. Enemy intelligence services now knew about the calculator and had placed a bounty on any information about his methods or identity. Security around David was tightened, and his access to the outside world became increasingly restricted for his own protection. "We're turning him into a prisoner," Jack Morgan observed during a briefing. By now, he had become one of David's strongest advocates among the pilots, having witnessed firsthand the life-saving accuracy of his predictions. "We're protecting a critical military asset," Colonel Wright corrected him. "Coleman's mind is worth more than all the aircraft in this hangar combined." David heard none of this discussion. He was staring at his screens, seeing a pattern emerging that chilled him to the bone. The data points were scattered across multiple systems, fuel consumption anomalies, maintenance requests, personnel rotation schedules, and encrypted communication fragments. Individually, each was meaningless. Together, they pointed to something catastrophic. "Sir," he said, his voice unnaturally tight as he entered the colonel's office without knocking, "we have a problem. A big one." The pattern David had identified pointed to a coordinated attack plan unlike anything they had encountered before. Multiple strike groups converging from different vectors, timed to exploit vulnerabilities in their defense grid that shouldn't have been known to outsiders. The scale suggested not just a security leak, but a massive intelligence breach that had compromised their entire operational security. "If I'm right, sir, they'll hit us in less than 72 hours. And they'll know exactly where our weaknesses are." Colonel Wright stared at the data. To him, it was just numbers and graphs. But he had learned to trust David's interpretation implicitly. "What do you recommend?" "A trap, sir. We let them think their intelligence is accurate, but we change the board at the last minute." For the next 48 hours, David worked without sleep, creating an elaborate deception plan that would turn the enemy's stolen intelligence against them. False flight plans were filed. Maintenance schedules were deliberately manipulated. Encrypted communications containing misleading information were allowed to flow through channels they knew were compromised. All the while, the real defensive preparations happened off the books, orchestrated through David's meticulous planning. Aircraft were repositioned under cover of darkness. Patrol routes were altered without digital records. Pilots were briefed in person rather than through normal channels. When the attack came, it was exactly as David had predicted: massive, coordinated, and precisely targeted. Except their targets were no longer where the attackers expected them to be. Instead, Jack Morgan's squadron and 3 others were waiting in precisely the positions David had calculated would provide maximum tactical advantage. The ensuing engagement was brief but decisive. Caught completely by surprise, the enemy forces found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned at every turn. What should have been a devastating blow to American air defenses instead became their worst defeat in decades. In the after-action briefing, The final tally was announced: 47 enemy aircraft neutralized, with 0 American casualties. David Coleman's predictive analysis had just recorded kills 41 through 47 in a single operation, saving not just a squadron but an entire airbase and potentially thousands of lives. When Jack sought out David to thank him personally, he found him not celebrating but already back at his screens, analyzing the engagement data for patterns that might help predict the next threat. "Don't you ever take a break?" Jack asked, amazed at the man's dedication. David looked up, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "The patterns don't take breaks, Captain Morgan. And neither can I." It was in that moment that Jack understood something fundamental about the quiet supply clerk who had become their most lethal weapon. David Coleman wasn't calculating kills, he was calculating lives saved. Each enemy asset neutralized represented American pilots who came home safely, missions that succeeded without casualties, families that remained intact. 47 confirmed kills, each one representing not death, but life preserved against overwhelming odds. Each one a testament to the power of seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. And all from a man who had never left his desk, never fired a weapon, and who still processed requisition forms in his spare time, because even in the midst of becoming a legend, David Coleman remembered where he came from. A supply clerk who had discovered that in the modern battlefield, the most powerful weapon wasn't a fighter jet or a missile system. It was a mind that could see the invisible threads connecting everything, and the quiet determination to follow those threads wherever they led. The human cost of intelligence work was something David Coleman understood all too well. Behind each digital blip on his screen lay real lives, pilots with families, soldiers with dreams, civilians caught in conflicts not of their making. As the awe surrounding his predictive abilities grew, so too did the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. 3 months after the operation that cemented his legend status, David found himself summoned to the Pentagon. The windowless conference room felt oppressive compared to his workspace at Nellis, where at least he'd been surrounded by familiar systems and data feeds that had become extensions of his consciousness. "Mr. Coleman," began General Harrington, a stern-faced man whose chest bore the weight of decades of service medals, "your work has attracted attention at the highest levels. What you've accomplished with simple pattern recognition has revolutionized our tactical operations." David nodded slightly, uncomfortable with the praise. "Thank you, sir. But it's just mathematics and observation. Anyone could do it with the right framework." The general exchanged glances with the intelligence director seated beside him. "That's precisely why we've brought you here. We don't believe just anyone could do what you've done. And we'd like to scale your capabilities." The proposal was ambitious, a new division within military intelligence dedicated entirely to pattern analysis. David would lead a team of analysts selected for their unique cognitive abilities, training them in his methodologies. The potential was staggering, not just reactive intelligence, but truly predictive capabilities, across multiple theaters of operation. "With all due respect, sir," David said quietly, "I'm not sure my approach can be taught. It's not a methodology so much as an intuition developed over time." "We understand that, Coleman. But even if you can transfer just a fraction of your capabilities to others, it would transform our intelligence capabilities. Think of it, teams of analysts identifying threats before they materialize, saving countless lives." David stared at the proposal document before him. The implications were enormous, but something felt wrong, a pattern he couldn't quite articulate yet. "May I have some time to consider this, sir?" The general nodded. "Take 24 hours. But remember, this is bigger than any one person now. Your country needs this capability." That evening, alone in his hotel room, David spread his personal notebooks across the bed. These weren't official records, but his private observations, the true foundation of his pattern recognition abilities. Years of meticulous documentation, connections others missed, anomalies that revealed deeper truths. As he reviewed them, a troubling pattern began to emerge, not in the data itself, but in how his analyzers were being utilized. Increasingly, his predictions were being used not just offensively, but to enable preemptive strikes. The line between protection and aggression was blurring, with his intelligence as the catalyst. The revelation struck him with physical force. He had joined the Air Force to serve, to protect, not to become the military's most efficient targeting system. His kill count had become a measure of his value, when for him, each prediction had only ever been about saving American lives. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Colonel Wright stood in the hallway, his expression grave. "You're not going to accept, are you?" the colonel asked as he entered the room. David looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I know you, Coleman. You didn't get into this to build better ways to kill people." "No," David admitted. "I didn't. But they're making it sound like I don't have a choice." Colonel Wright sat heavily in the room's single chair. "There's always a choice, son. But sometimes all the options come with costs." The choice crystallized for David during that sleepless night. By morning, he had made his decision, one that would fundamentally alter the course of his work and potentially his life. "I'll establish the program," he told General Harrington the next day, "but with one non-negotiable condition. The Pattern Analysis Division will function exclusively as a defensive unit. We predict threats, protect assets, and prevent casualties. We don't target, we don't assassinate, and we don't provide offensive intelligence." The general's face darkened. "That's not how military intelligence works, Coleman. We don't artificially separate defense from offense." "It's how my intelligence works," David replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "Or it doesn't work at all." For 3 tense days, the proposal hung in bureaucratic limbo while David's ultimatum was debated at levels far above his pay grade. He prepared himself for the consequences: potential court-martial for insubordination, reassignment to some remote outpost, or worst of all, being forced out of the service entirely. On the 4th day, Colonel Wright arrived with surprising news. "They accepted your terms." With caveats, but they accepted. The Pattern Analysis Division was established under David's leadership, with an explicit charter focusing on defensive operations and threat prevention. His team would identify vulnerabilities, predict enemy movements, and protect American assets, but the intelligence they generated would not be directly used for targeting or elimination operations. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed the work to proceed. And it set the stage for the most challenging phase of David's career, teaching others to see what he saw. The first candidates arrived 2 weeks later, 12 analysts, selected for their exceptional cognitive abilities and unconventional thinking. They came from diverse backgrounds: a former chess prodigy, a meteorologist who had predicted hurricane patterns with uncanny accuracy, a financial analyst who had foreseen the 2023 banking crisis months before it happened. None of them had military backgrounds. Most had never even considered government service. All were skeptics. "With respect, Mr. Coleman," said Eliza Chen, the financial analyst, during their first briefing, "pattern recognition in market behavior is fundamentally different from military operations. Human decisions don't follow mathematical models." David smiled slightly. "Actually, they do, just not the models most people look for. Markets respond to fear and greed. Military operations respond to aggression and self-preservation. The underlying patterns of human decision-making remain remarkably consistent." He projected a series of data points onto the main screen, seemingly random numbers that meant nothing in isolation. "Tell me what you see," he challenged them. Silence filled the room as the analysts studied the figures. After several minutes, Marcus Way, the chess prodigy, spoke up. "These are fuel consumption rates, but they're oscillating in an unusual pattern. almost like someone is deliberately creating noise in the data. David nodded. Good, what else? Slowly, tentatively, the analysts began to identify fragments of patterns, maintenance schedules that didn't align with mission reports, personnel rotations that created periodic gaps in expertise, communication protocols with subtle vulnerabilities. None of them saw the complete picture, but together they were beginning to glimpse the connections that David perceived intuitively. This is how we start, he told them. Not by looking for the obvious patterns, but by identifying the anomalies, the places where the data doesn't fit our expectations. Those discrepancies are where the truth hides. Over the following weeks, David immersed his team in what they came to call Coleman methodology, a holistic approach to data analysis that incorporated not just hard metrics but contextual factors most intelligence work overlooked. They studied how weather patterns affected pilot decision-making, how cultural backgrounds influenced tactical choices, how equipment maintenance cycles created predictable vulnerabilities. Progress was slow and frustrating. What came naturally to David required painstaking effort for even these exceptional analysts. There were moments when he questioned whether his abilities could ever be taught at all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Patel, a quiet linguist who had been included in the program almost as an afterthought, approached David after hours one evening. "I think we're approaching this wrong," she said, laying out a series of notebooks. "We're trying to see the patterns the way you do, but each of us processes information differently. We need to translate your methodology into different cognitive frameworks." She had created a series of linguistic models, essentially different languages for pattern recognition tailored to each analyst's natural thinking style. For Marcus, she framed everything in terms of chess strategy. For Eliza, market behaviors. For herself, syntactic structures. "We don't need to see exactly what you see," Sarah explained. "We just need reliable translations of those patterns into frameworks we already understand." It was brilliant. And it worked. Within days, the team's analytical capabilities improved dramatically. They weren't replicating David's intuitive genius. They were building parallel systems that achieved similar results through different cognitive pathways. Their first real test came sooner than anyone expected. An urgent call from Pacific Command arrived at 0300 hours. Unusual naval movements had been detected near disputed territories, suggesting potential offensive operations against U.S. allies in the region. Conventional intelligence had identified the activity, but couldn't determine intent or likely scenarios. David assembled his team, now dubbed the calculators, throughout the intelligence community. They approached the problem from multiple angles, each analyst applying their unique perspective to the available data. Marcus identified tactical patterns reminiscent of specific naval exercises conducted the previous year. Eliza noted resource allocations that suggested a timeline for potential engagement. Sarah detected communication patterns that indicated coordination with land-based assets. Individually, each insight was valuable but incomplete. Together, under David's guidance, they constructed a comprehensive assessment that not only identified the threat, but predicted its evolution with shocking precision. "They're creating a diversion," David concluded, pointing to the pattern his team had collectively uncovered. "These naval movements are designed to draw attention while their actual operation targets these communication nodes here and here. If successful, it would blind our early warning systems for approximately 47 minutes, enough time for a secondary strike force to penetrate defended airspace undetected." Pacific Command acted on their analysis, repositioning assets to counter the true threat rather than responding to the diversion. When the operation unfolded exactly as David's team had predicted, their reputation was sealed. The Pattern Analysis Division had just prevented what could have been a devastating strike against American forces without firing a single shot. Back at the Pentagon, General Harrington reluctantly acknowledged the success of David's defensive approach. 48 potential casualties averted according to our estimates. I suppose that counts as 48 more kills for your record, Coleman. David shook his head. No, sir. We don't count that way in my division. We count lives saved, not enemies eliminated. The general studied him for a long moment. You know, most people who join the military want to make a difference by taking action. You're making a difference by understanding before anyone else what action needs to be taken. That's rare. As the Pattern Analysis Division's successes mounted, David faced a new and unexpected challenge: celebrity. The quiet supply clerk who had become the military's most effective intelligence asset was now the subject of whispered legends throughout the armed forces. Pilots requested calculator clearance before difficult missions. Commanders sought pad analysis before committing to operations. Even the Secretary of Defense had mentioned Coleman methodology in a classified briefing to the President. David retreated further into his work, uncomfortable with the attention. He expanded his team carefully, adding only analysts who shared his fundamental approach to intelligence as a protective rather than offensive tool. The division's charter was expanded to include civilian protection missions, identifying potential terrorist threats, predicting natural disasters where military assistance would be needed, even helping to coordinate complex humanitarian operations in conflict zones. This shift brought David into direct contact with the human impact of his work for the first time. No longer was he simply tracking blips on a screen. He was helping to evacuate villages before they were caught in crossfire, directing aid to regions before they reached crisis points, protecting refugee corridors from potential attacks. Jack Morgan, now promoted to colonel, visited the pad facility after a particularly successful operation that had saved an entire humanitarian convoy from an ambush. You know what they're calling you now? He asked David as they walked through the analysis center where dozens of specialists now worked around the clock. The guardian angel has a better ring than the calculator, don't you think? David winced at the nickname. I'm just doing my job, Jack, the same as I did in the supply office. That's not even remotely true, and you know it, Jack laughed. In the supply office, you counted spare parts. Now you're saving lives by the hundreds. The principle is the same, David insisted. Identifying patterns, preventing problems before they occur. It's just logistics on a different scale. Jack shook his head in amazement. Only you would see it that way. But that's why it works, isn't it? You never wanted the glory. You just wanted to make systems function better. Efficient systems mean people come home alive, David said simply. That's all that matters. As David's team continued to expand their capabilities, a new pattern began to emerge in global conflicts, one that troubled him deeply. Increasingly, adversaries were adapting their operations specifically to counter pattern analysis. They introduced deliberate randomness into their activities, created false data trails, and executed meaningless maneuvers designed solely to confuse predictive intelligence. They're evolving, he explained to Colonel Wright during their weekly briefing. Not just reacting to our specific predictions anymore, but fundamentally changing how they operate to become less predictable. Isn't that just the nature of warfare? Wright asked. Measure, countermeasure, countermeasure? David shook his head. This is different. They're sacrificing tactical efficiency for unpredictability, making objectively worse decisions just to avoid being anticipated. It's irrational. Fear makes people irrational, Coleman. And you've given them plenty to fear. The implications were profound. If adversaries continued to prioritize unpredictability over sound tactical decision-making, the entire nature of conflict would change. Operations would become more chaotic, less controlled, and potentially more dangerous for civilians caught in the crossfire. We need to adapt our approach, David told his team the next morning. We've been looking for optimal patterns, the most efficient paths to tactical objectives. But our adversaries are now deliberately choosing suboptimal approaches. We need to model irrationality. It was their greatest challenge yet. How do you predict the behavior of an opponent who is intentionally behaving unpredictably? How do you find patterns in deliberate chaos? The answer came not from advanced analytics, but from a simple observation by one of David's newest team members, a former kindergarten teacher named Michael who had been recruited for his uncanny ability to anticipate children's behavior. Even randomness has patterns, Michael explained. When children try to be unpredictable, they actually follow recognizable patterns of unpredictability. True randomness is almost impossible for humans to generate intentionally. This insight led to a breakthrough in the division's methodology. Instead of looking for optimal tactical patterns, they began mapping chaos patterns, the specific ways in which different military organizations introduced unpredictability into their operations. These chaos patterns turned out to be as distinctive as fingerprints. Some adversaries favored timing irregularities. Others introduced spatial randomness. Still others created decision-making noise through unnecessary communications. By cataloging these distinctive chaos patterns, David's team regained their predictive edge. They couldn't always anticipate the specific tactics an adversary would employ, but they could identify the type of unpredictability they would introduce and prepare countermeasures accordingly. This evolution in their approach led to the pattern analysis, Division's greatest triumph, and David Coleman's most profound moral test. Intelligence reports identified a gathering of high-level adversary commanders in a remote compound. Conventional analysis suggested this represented a rare opportunity for a decisive strike that could potentially end a protracted conflict. Military leadership pressed for immediate action based on the intelligence. But David's team saw a different pattern. The gathering displayed none of the security measures typically associated with high-level meetings. Communications patterns didn't match historical precedents. Resource allocations in the region suggested alternative priorities. It's a trap, David concluded after analyzing his team's findings. They're deliberately creating a high-value target profile to draw our forces into an ambush. Military leadership was skeptical. The opportunity seemed too perfect to pass up, and conventional intelligence strongly supported immediate action. For the first time since establishing the Pattern Analysis Division, David found himself directly opposing a planned offensive operation rather than simply focusing on defense. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If he was wrong, a crucial opportunity would be lost. If he was right, hundreds of American servicemen and women would be saved from a devastating ambush. "I need more than theories and patterns, Coleman," General Harrington insisted during an emergency briefing. "I need concrete evidence before I cancel an operation of this significance." "The evidence is in the pattern itself, sir," David responded calmly. "The absence of expected security measures isn't an oversight, it's deliberate. The communications anomalies aren't random. They're calculated to attract our attention while concealing the actual threat." For hours the debate continued, with conventional intelligence analysts challenging David's assessment and military commanders growing increasingly frustrated with the delay. Finally, David made an unprecedented request. "Let me go in with the initial reconnaissance team. If I'm wrong, we proceed with the operation as planned. If I'm right, we'll have evidence of the ambush before our main forces are committed." The weight of David's decision pressed down on him as he boarded the military transport aircraft. For years, he had operated from behind screens, analyzing patterns and predicting outcomes, without witnessing the human consequences firsthand. Now strapped into a seat beside veteran Special Forces operators, he was about to experience the reality of combat intelligence from the front lines. "Never thought I'd see the calculator in the field," remarked Captain Reyes, the reconnaissance team leader. "Thought you were allergic to sunlight or something." David managed a weak smile, clutching his tablet containing the analytical models that had led him to this moment. Some patterns you need to see in person. The aircraft touched down at a forward operating base near the border of the conflict zone. From there, the team would move covertly to a position overlooking the compound where the supposed high-level meeting was taking place. David's presence had been strongly opposed by multiple senior officers, but General Harrington had ultimately relented, partly out of respect for David's track record, partly out of curiosity about his methods. "Coleman," the general had said before approving the mission, "if you're wrong about this, your credibility is finished. Your division might be as well." "I understand, sir," David had replied. "But I'm not wrong." As the reconnaissance team moved through rugged terrain under cover of darkness, David struggled to keep pace. His years behind a desk had not prepared him for the physical demands of field operations. Captain Reyes slowed occasionally, ensuring their civilian analyst wasn't left behind. "How exactly do you expect to spot this ambush?" Reyes asked during a brief rest. "We've got the best surveillance equipment available, and our advanced drones haven't detected anything unusual." David wiped sweat from his brow. "I'm not looking for the unusual. I'm looking for the deliberately usual, the patterns that are too perfect to be natural." The captain shook his head, clearly skeptical. "If you say so, calculator." By dawn, they had reached the observation point, a ridge offering a clear view of the compound below. Intelligence reports had identified it as the gathering place for up to a dozen high-ranking enemy commanders. The main strike force was on standby, awaiting confirmation before launching what could be a decisive operation. David sat apart from the reconnaissance team as they set up their surveillance equipment. He wasn't interested in their telephoto images or thermal readings. Instead, he studied the landscape, the movement patterns of guards, the timing of shift changes, elements most military observers would consider routine background information. After an hour of observation, Captain Reyes approached him. "We're detecting multiple heat signatures consistent with the intelligence briefing. Vehicles arriving match expected profiles. Whatever you're looking for, calculator, you'd better find it quick." Command is getting impatient. David nodded, eyes never leaving the scene below. "Tell them to wait. Something isn't right." What troubled him wasn't what he could see, but what was missing. The guard patrols moved with machine-like precision, too perfect, too predictable for a high-security operation. The communications equipment visible on the compound rooftop was standard issue, not the enhanced systems typically used for high-level meetings. And most tellingly, there was no sign of the secondary security perimeter his team had identified in every previous gathering of this significance. "They want us to attack," he murmured. "They've constructed the perfect target." Captain Reyes frowned. "Based on what? Guards walking in predictable patterns? That's just poor training." "No," David replied. "It's deliberate. These aren't poorly trained guards. These are elite units deliberately creating a pattern designed to look authentic to casual observation, but obvious to anyone who knows what to look for." He pointed to his tablet, where he had been plotting the movement patterns. "Look at the precision. No random variations, no human inconsistencies. It's like watching actors follow marks on a stage." The captain studied the data, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. "Even if you're right about the guards, that doesn't prove it's an ambush." "No," David agreed. "But this does." He switched to a different screen showing thermal imaging from the reconnaissance team's equipment, which he had been quietly analyzing. "The heat signatures in the main building are wrong. They're consistent with heat generators, not human bodies. And look at these cold spots in the surrounding terrain. Perfect positions for concealed forces with active cooling equipment to mask their presence." Captain Reyes stared at the analysis, then grabbed his radio. "All units hold positions. Possible ambush scenario." He turned to David. "If you're wrong about this—" "I'm not," David said quietly. "But we need to be sure. Can your team deploy micro-drones with ground-penetrating capabilities?" Within minutes, the reconnaissance team had launched tiny surveillance drones no larger than hummingbirds. The data they returned confirmed David's suspicions in devastating detail. The entire area surrounding the compound had been prepared with concealed fighting positions, underground bunkers, and camouflaged anti-aircraft systems, a killing zone designed to trap and eliminate the planned attack force. Captain Reyes stared at the evidence in stunned silence before contacting command. "General, this is Reyes. Coleman was right. The whole thing is an elaborate trap. If we'd gone in with the main force..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. The operation was immediately aborted, and the reconnaissance team ordered to withdraw before their presence was detected. As they made their way back to the extraction point, Captain Reyes fell in beside David. "How many?" he asked. "How many what?" David replied, struggling to navigate the difficult terrain. "How many lives did you just save? What's the count now?" David shook his head. "I don't keep count, Captain." "Well, I do," Reyes said firmly. The strike package included 4 helicopter gunships, 6 transport helicopters carrying assault teams, and close air support aircraft. Minimum crew and troops, over 200 personnel. All of whom are going home to their families tonight because you saw something nobody else did. The implications of the captain's words hit David with physical force. 200 lives saved, not as abstract data points on a screen, but as flesh and blood human beings who would continue to exist because of a pattern he had identified. Upon their return to base, the debriefing was intense. Military intelligence officers struggled to understand how they had been so thoroughly deceived, while operational commanders grappled with the realization of how close they had come to disaster. General Harrington pulled David aside after the formal proceedings. "I owe you an apology, Coleman. When you established the Pattern Analysis Division with its defensive focus, I thought you were being idealistic, maybe even naive. But you just demonstrated why that approach works." David nodded, too exhausted for lengthy discussion. "Offensive operations create predictable response patterns, sir. When we focus on protection rather than aggression, we see things others miss." The general studied him thoughtfully. 200 lives, Coleman. That brings your total to what now? Over 250? I don't count, sir. Well, the Pentagon does. And after this, your methodology won't just be respected, it'll be required study at every intelligence training facility we have. The incident marked a turning point in how military leadership viewed the Pattern Analysis Division. No longer was it seen as merely a useful support function. It had become an essential component of operational planning. More importantly, David's insistence on a defensive focus was no longer questioned. His approach had proven its value in the most convincing way possible. Back at PAD headquarters, David gathered his team for a comprehensive review of what they had learned. The adversary's attempt to create a perfect trap had itself followed predictable patterns his analysts could now identify in future operations. They tried to be too perfect, he explained, showing them the surveillance data. Real operations have inconsistencies, human variations that can't be eliminated. By creating a scenario with mechanical precision, they revealed their deception. Eliza Chun, now his deputy director, nodded in understanding. So we look for the absence of natural randomness as a potential indicator of deception. Exactly, David confirmed. Sometimes the most telling pattern is the pattern that's missing. The team incorporated this insight into their analytical frameworks, adding a new dimension to their already formidable capabilities. In the months that followed, they identified multiple similar deception attempts, each one neutralized before it could threaten American forces. David's reluctant fame continued to grow. Stories of the calculator had spread throughout the military and into the intelligence community at large. Foreign services were reportedly establishing their own pattern analysis divisions, though none had yet replicated the success of David's approach. What few people understood was the personal toll his work was taking. The constant pressure to identify threats, the knowledge that lives depended on his analysis. The growing isolation as his unique cognitive abilities set him further apart from colleagues. All of it weighed heavily on the quiet supply clerk who had never sought the spotlight. Colonel Jack Morgan, still one of David's few true friends, noticed the changes during a rare social gathering at the officers' club. "You look exhausted," Jack observed, pushing a glass of water toward David, who never drank alcohol. "When was the last time you took leave?" David shrugged. "The patterns don't take vacations, Jack." "Maybe not, but the people who track them need to." "You've been at this for what, almost 5 years straight now?" "Nobody can maintain that pace indefinitely." "I'm fine," David insisted, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. Jack leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Dave. I've seen this before in elite pilots, special forces operators, people who carry responsibilities others can't understand. They push themselves until something breaks. Don't be that guy." David managed a weak smile. "I appreciate the concern, but this is different. I'm not in physical danger. I'm just looking at data." "The mind can break too," Jack replied seriously. "And when it happens to someone like you, with hundreds of lives depending on your judgment, the consequences could be catastrophic." The warning lingered in David's thoughts long after the conversation ended. Was his judgment becoming impaired? Were the patterns becoming blurred? He had no way to objectively evaluate his own cognitive state, a realization that troubled him deeply. The following week, David implemented a new protocol within the Pattern Analysis Division. Each analyst, including himself, would undergo regular cognitive assessment by their peers. Any degradation in pattern recognition abilities, any unusual analytical conclusions, would trigger mandatory rest periods and supplementary review procedures. "We need to be as systematic about maintaining our minds as mechanics are about maintaining aircraft," he told his team. "Our judgment affects too many lives to risk cognitive failure." This approach, treating analysts' minds as critical equipment, requiring regular maintenance, was unprecedented in intelligence work. Like many of David's innovations, it was initially met with skepticism, but quickly proved its value. The first test came when Marcus Way, one of his senior analysts, flagged his own analysis for review after recognizing inconsistencies in his work. The peer assessment confirmed a significant decline in pattern recognition capabilities, traced to extreme fatigue and personal stress. After a 2-week mandatory rest period, Marcus's abilities returned to baseline, potentially averting missed threats or false identifications that could have had serious consequences. David himself underwent the same evaluations, reluctantly accepting a finding that he needed reduced workload and improved sleep hygiene to maintain optimal cognitive function. For perhaps the first time in his career, he acknowledged that even his extraordinary mind had limits that needed to be respected. This revelation, that maintaining analytical capability required self-care, led to further innovations in how the Pattern Analysis Division operated. Work shifts were restructured to align with natural cognitive rhythms. Quiet spaces were created for mental recovery between intense analysis sessions. Physical activity was built into daily schedules after research showed its benefits for pattern recognition. "We're not machines," David told General Harrington during a program review. "Treating analysts like computers that can run constantly without maintenance isn't just inhumane, it's inefficient. Well-rested, balanced minds see patterns more clearly." The general, initially skeptical of what he considered coddling, was convinced when presented with clear data showing improved analytical outcomes under the new protocols. Once again, David had changed military thinking by focusing on patterns others had missed, in this case, the patterns of human cognitive performance. As the Pattern Analysis Division continued to evolve, David found himself drawn to a new challenge, identifying patterns not just in enemy activities, but in conflicts themselves. Were there recognizable signatures that indicated when violence was likely to escalate? Could patterns predict when adversaries might be open to de-escalation or peace initiatives? This approach was even more controversial than his previous work. Military leadership was comfortable with intelligence that helped them win conflicts more efficiently, less comfortable with analysis suggesting some conflicts could be avoided entirely. This isn't intelligence work anymore, Coleman. General Harrington objected when David presented his preliminary findings. It's foreign policy, and that's not your purview. With respect, sir, it's pattern recognition, David countered. The same principles apply whether we're tracking aircraft movements or conflict trajectories. And if we can identify opportunities to protect lives through de-escalation rather than combat, isn't that consistent with our defensive mandate? The general had no immediate answer, but he didn't shut down the research either. Something in David's presentation had resonated, perhaps the simple logic that preventing conflicts entirely was the ultimate form of defense. Quietly, with a small team of his most trusted analysts, David began developing what they called the Peace Pattern Protocol, a framework for identifying moments when conflicts were at inflection points where diplomatic intervention might be particularly effective. Their first success came in a regional dispute that had been simmering for months. Conventional intelligence suggested the situation was deteriorating toward inevitable armed conflict. But David's team identified a pattern suggesting an opening for mediation-specific communication signals, resource allocations, and population movements that historically preceded successful peace negotiations rather than escalation. When they presented their analysis to State Department officials, the reception was initially dismissive. Diplomats, like military leaders, had their own established methods and were reluctant to incorporate this novel approach. But one senior envoy, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, saw the potential. If you're right about this window of opportunity, she told David during a classified briefing, it could prevent a war that would devastate the region. I'm willing to test your methodology. Using the PAD analysis as a guide, Ambassador Vasquez initiated precisely timed diplomatic outreach to the conflicting parties. The approach worked better than anyone had anticipated. Within weeks, tensions had noticeably de-escalated, and preliminary peace talks were underway. News of this success reached the highest levels of government. For David Coleman, it represented something even more significant than his previous achievements. This wasn't just about saving lives by predicting threats. It was about preventing the need for those predictions in the first place. The ultimate pattern, he explained to his team, is the cycle of conflict itself. If we can recognize the signatures of that cycle, we can help break it before violence becomes inevitable. This evolution in David's work attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Academic institutions requested access to his methodologies for conflict resolution studies. International organizations explored applications for early warning systems in potential genocide zones. Private sector companies sought his insights for crisis management. Through it all, David remained the same quiet, methodical analyst he had always been. Fame, awards, and recognition held no appeal for him. What mattered was the work, the patterns themselves, and the lives they could protect when properly understood. On the 5th anniversary of the Pattern Analysis Division's founding, a small ceremony was held at the Pentagon. David had initially declined to attend, preferring to remain at his workstation, but Colonel Wright had insisted. "Some symbols matter, Coleman," the colonel had told him. "Your team needs to see their work valued at the highest levels." The ceremony was brief and, at David's request, focused on the division's accomplishments rather than his personal contributions. But as he stood awkwardly accepting the commendation from the Secretary of Defense, he found himself reflecting on the journey from supply clerk to intelligence pioneer. Later that evening, alone in his office reviewing data streams, as he did most nights, David received an unexpected visitor. General Harrington entered without announcement, carrying a small box. "They wanted to give you this at the ceremony," the general said, placing the box on David's desk. "You slipped away before they had the chance." Inside the box lay a medal, not a standard military commendation, but something specially created. The inscription reads simply, "For lives saved through pattern recognition, -258 and counting." David stared at it, momentarily speechless. "I told you I don't keep count," he finally managed. "You don't," General Harrington agreed. "But we do. Though I suspect the actual number is far higher, this only includes direct interventions we could verify with absolute certainty." David closed the box without taking out the medal. "Thank you, sir, but this isn't necessary. I was just doing my job." The general settled into a chair across from David's desk. "You know, Coleman, in all my years of service, I've met thousands of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. I've pinned medals on heroes who charged into gunfire, pilots who flew impossible missions, medics who saved lives under the worst conditions imaginable. But I've never met anyone quite like you, sir. Most people who save lives do it in the moment, courage, adrenaline, training taking over. You do it through sheer intellectual persistence, through seeing things nobody else can see. It's a different kind of heroism, but it's heroism nonetheless." David shook his head slightly. "I'm an analyst, sir. Not a hero. 258 families would disagree with you." The general stood to leave. "Anyway, keep the medal or don't. That's your choice. But know that what you've built here matters. It's changing how we think about intelligence, about conflict itself." After the general left, David sat alone staring at the closed box. The idea of being recognized for lives saved made him deeply uncomfortable. In his mind, he was still the quiet supply clerk who had simply applied the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always used, just with higher stakes. His contemplation was interrupted by an urgent call from the operations center. An anomaly had been detected in a data stream from the Pacific Theater, something that didn't match any known pattern, but triggered several of the division's early warning algorithms. Grateful for the distraction, David hurried to the analytical hub where his team was already assembling. Eliza Chun briefed him quickly. "We're seeing unusual activity across multiple military networks in the region. Not a cyber attack in the conventional sense, but a pattern of access requests that doesn't match any known operational protocol." David studied the data, immediately recognizing what his team had detected. "It's a probing operation. They're mapping our command and control architecture, looking for vulnerabilities." "That's our assessment too," Eliza confirmed. "But there's something else." She highlighted a secondary data stream showing communication patterns between multiple adversary systems. "These signal characteristics don't match any known military entity in the region. It's like a completely new player has entered the field." David felt a familiar sense of focus descend as he immersed himself in the patterns. This was where he belonged, not receiving medals or attending ceremonies, but engaged in the pure analytical work of understanding threats before they materialized. For the next several hours, he worked alongside his team to identify the nature of this new anomaly. What they discovered was both fascinating and alarming evidence of a previously unknown autonomous system being tested in international waters, one with capabilities beyond anything they had encountered before. "It's not just a weapons platform," David explained when they briefed military leadership. "It's a distributed intelligence network, multiple, autonomous units that communicate and coordinate without human intervention. They're learning our patrol patterns, response protocols, everything." Admiral James, commander of Pacific Forces, looked skeptical. "Are you saying we're facing some kind of artificial intelligence threat, Coleman?" "Not exactly, sir. These are sophisticated automated systems, but they're still following human programming. What makes them dangerous is their ability to adapt based on the data they collect. The Admiral frowned. "And your recommendation?" "Change everything," David said simply. "Alter our patrol patterns, communication protocols, response procedures. Not just slightly, completely. These systems are designed to identify and exploit patterns. Our best defense is to become deliberately unpredictable." It was a radical proposal, essentially rewriting operational procedures that had been refined over decades. But David's track record had earned him enough credibility that even this extraordinary recommendation was taken seriously. Over the following weeks, Pacific Command implemented what they called Protocol Kaleidoscope, a fundamental shift away from standardized operations toward an approach that incorporated deliberate variability and unpredictability. Patrol routes were randomized. Communication frequencies changed according to complex algorithms. Response protocols were modified to include multiple possible reactions to potential threats. The results were immediately apparent. The probing activities that had triggered the initial alarm diminished rapidly as the autonomous systems encountered unpredictable responses that defied their pattern recognition capabilities. "They can't exploit what they can't predict," David explained during a follow-up briefing. "By introducing controlled chaos into our operations, we've essentially rendered their intelligence gathering ineffective." For David, this success represented a profound evolution in his approach to pattern analysis. He had begun by identifying patterns that others missed. Then he had learned to teach others to see those patterns. Now he was using his understanding of patterns to deliberately break them, to create systems that defied prediction. This insight led to the development of what became known as Coleman counter-patterning, a methodology for protecting critical systems by making them resistant to pattern analysis. The approach spread beyond military applications into cybersecurity, financial systems protection, even counter-terrorism operations. As his influence expanded, David remained stubbornly grounded in the day-to-day analytical work he loved. He declined speaking engagements, avoided press interviews, and turned down lucrative private sector offers. His focus remained unwavering, identifying threats, protecting lives, preventing conflicts. "I don't understand why you stay," Jack Morgan said during one of their infrequent dinners. "You could write your own ticket anywhere. Consulting firms are offering millions for your expertise. Think what you could do with that kind of resources." David smiled slightly. "I have all the resources I need here, Jack, and this is where the work matters most." "The work would matter anywhere you did it," Jack argued. "Your methodologies could transform corporate security, cybersecurity, even public health. Think bigger, Dave." "Maybe someday," David conceded. "But not yet. There's still too much to do here." What David didn't say, couldn't fully articulate even to himself, was that his work had become more than just analysis. It had become a mission, perhaps even a calling. The patterns he saw weren't just data points. They were threads connecting human lives, vulnerabilities that needed protection, conflicts that could be prevented before they began. As the Pattern Analysis Division approached its 6th anniversary, a new challenge emerged that would test David's abilities like never before. Unusual activities had been detected across multiple theaters of operation, subtle shifts in adversary, behavior that didn't fit any known strategic doctrine. "It's like they're positioning for something," David explained to his senior team during a late-night analysis session. "Not an immediate strike, but a fundamental realignment. I've never seen a pattern quite like this before." For weeks, they tracked the anomalies, gathering data from across the globe. Gradually, a disturbing picture emerged, evidence of coordination among previously unaligned adversaries, technological sharing that crossed traditional boundaries, and preparation for what appeared to be a synchronized global operation of unprecedented scale. "We're looking at a potential paradigm shift," David told General Harrington during an emergency briefing. "Not just a tactical threat, but a strategic one that could fundamentally alter the global security landscape." The general studied the analysis with grave concern. "Your confidence level on this assessment?" 93%, David replied without hesitation. The individual data points could be explained away as coincidence or misinterpretation, but the aggregate pattern is unmistakable. "And your recommendation?" David took a deep breath. What he was about to propose went far beyond his usual analytical role. "We need a coordinated global response, sir. Not just military, but diplomatic, economic, technological, all working in concert. This isn't a threat that can be countered through conventional means. The scale of the response matched the scale of the threat." For the first time, David found himself briefing not just military leadership, but the President and National Security Council. His quiet, methodical explanation of the patterns he had identified held the room in rapt attention. "Mr. Coleman," the President said afterward, "you've identified what could be the most significant security threat of my administration. What I need to know now is, can it be stopped?" David didn't hesitate. "Yes, Madam President, but not through confrontation. The pattern suggests that a direct challenge would accelerate rather than deter their plans. We need to change the underlying conditions that make their strategy viable." Over the following months, David worked closely with a multi-agency task force implementing what became known as the Coleman Doctrine, a comprehensive approach to countering coordinated global threats through system-level interventions rather than direct confrontation. The strategy was elegant in its conception, but enormously complex in execution. It required coordinated diplomatic initiatives, strategic economic adjustments, targeted technological development, and carefully calibrated military repositioning, all designed to alter the strategic landscape in ways that would render the adversary's plans obsolete. "We're not fighting the threat directly," David explained to his expanded team, which now included diplomats, economists, and technology experts alongside his core analysts. "We're changing the environment so that their strategy no longer makes sense." As the strategy unfolded over months, its effectiveness became increasingly apparent. The coordinated activities that had triggered David's initial alarm began to fragment and dissipate. Adversaries abandoned joint initiatives, technological sharing slowed, and the synchronized positioning that had suggested imminent action gradually dissolved. Without a shot being fired, without a direct confrontation, a potential global crisis had been averted through the application of pattern recognition at its most sophisticated level. In the aftermath, David was summoned to the Oval Office for a private meeting with the President. "Mr. Coleman," she began, "I've been briefed on the final assessment of what we now call the silent crisis. According to our best estimates, your intervention prevented what could have been the most significant conflict since World War II. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It wasn't just me, Madam President. It was the entire task force, all the agencies working together. Working according to your framework," she corrected him. "Following the patterns you identified. The Joint Chiefs estimate the potential casualties that were avoided number in the millions. That brings your total to what now?" David sighed. "With respect, Madam President, I still don't count." The President smiled. "I know. That's why I wanted to meet with you personally. To offer you something I think you might actually value more than a medal or a promotion." "Ma'am." "A chance to build something permanent. The National Pattern Analysis Institute, a civilian agency with the mission of identifying and addressing global threats before they materialize. Not just military threats, but pandemics, climate disasters, economic crises, anything where early pattern recognition could save lives." For the first time in their conversation, David's full attention was engaged. "A civilian agency? Independent of military command? With appropriate security classifications and oversight, yes. The focus would be on protection and prevention, Not offensive operations, exactly the approach you've championed from the beginning. It was as if she had read his mind, or more likely, had been well briefed on his philosophy and motivations. The opportunity to expand his work beyond military applications, to address the full spectrum of threats to human welfare, was exactly what he had been working toward without fully realizing it. "I would be honored, Madam President," he said simply. The transition from military intelligence specialist to founding director of a civilian agency brought new challenges for David Coleman. Building organizational structures, navigating political realities, and communicating complex analytical concepts to non-specialists, these were far from his natural strengths. But he approached these challenges the same way he approached everything, by identifying patterns, developing systems, and focusing relentlessly on the core mission. The National Pattern Analysis Institute gradually took shape under his guidance, recruiting brilliant minds from diverse fields: epidemiology, climate science, economics, social psychology, and more, all united by the common methodology of pattern recognition and early intervention. 2 years into its existence, the Institute achieved its first major success outside the military domain, identifying the early signatures of an emerging pandemic and implementing containment measures before it could spread globally. Millions of lives were saved through early detection and targeted intervention, without the economic and social devastation that would have accompanied a full-scale outbreak. This was followed by successful early interventions in potential financial crises, environmental disasters, and social conflicts, each one prevented or mitigated before most people were even aware of the threat. For David, now in his 40s, these successes represented the fulfillment of what had begun as a simple desire to make systems work better. The quiet supply clerk who had once been mocked for his meticulous attention to detail had transformed that same quality into a methodology that was quite literally changing the world. On a rare day away from the Institute, David visited Arlington National Cemetery, walking slowly among the graves of servicemen and women who had given their lives in conflicts throughout American history. Many of these conflicts, he reflected, might have been prevented with the tools and methods his team was now developing. As he stood in contemplation, he felt a presence beside him. Colonel Wright, now retired but still involved with the Institute as an advisor, had joined him silently. "Thinking about the ones we couldn't save?" the colonel asked. David nodded. "And wondering how many of these might never have happened at all if we'd understood the pattern sooner. You can't change the past, Coleman. But you're changing the future. That counts for something." They walked together in silence for a while before Wright spoke again. "Do you know what they call you now?" "Not the calculator anymore." David winced. "I've heard a few things." "The peacemaker," Wright said. "Because you're stopping wars before they start. I think it suits you better than the old nickname." David smiled slightly. "I still prefer just David." "Too late for that," Wright laughed. "Legends don't get to choose their names." Later that evening, alone in his office reviewing the day's analysis reports, David reflected on his journey. From the windowless supply room at Nellis to the director's office of a national institute, it had been a path no one could have predicted, least of all himself. His phone buzzed with a notification from the institute's early warning system, a potential emerging threat that had triggered their most sensitive algorithms. Without hesitation, he set aside his personal reflections and focused on the data, looking for the patterns that would reveal the nature of the threat and the intervention needed. This was who he was now, who perhaps he had always been. Not a hero, not a legend, but simply a man who saw patterns others missed and used that gift to protect what mattered most. The quiet supply clerk had become something else entirely, yet remained fundamentally unchanged in his core purpose. The count of lives saved had long since surpassed any meaningful calculation. What mattered wasn't the number, but the principle, that understanding came before action, that prevention was better than response. that the patterns connecting all things could be understood by those patient enough to look for them. And in a world of increasing complexity and danger, perhaps that understanding was the most powerful weapon of all, a way to shape the future not through force, but through insight. To win conflicts not by fighting, but by preventing them entirely. The quiet supply clerk with 47 confirmed kills had never fired a weapon or harmed another human being. Yet he had saved more lives than any warrior in history, not through violence, but through understanding, not through power, but through perception. In the end, his greatest victory wasn't counted in enemies defeated, but in conflicts that never happened, in crises that never materialized, in a world that would never know how close it had come to disaster, because someone had seen the pattern in time and quietly, methodically, changed its course. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.